Alright, so the first one that I did was the title, so line A. I thought it was interesting the way the author only used a capital letter in R, so running into an old friend right here. I thought that was interesting, and I made a prediction that there might be some dialogue maybe in our essay, just based on the way that it sounds like it's kind of in a narrative tone. Then, after that, I went on to line 1. Scroll down so you guys can see a little bit better. In line 1, the way the author says reading an absorbing story is similar to actually experiencing the event. I reread this line twice because I like the way the author used the word absorbing and then experienced or experiencing in the same line. The way that the author said absorbing story and experiencing is just kind of how I would like to read stories all the time, and in that way I had to reread it twice to comprehend what the author was actually saying. Going on to the next line where the author says, "How could it be otherwise when the sight of a beloved book takes me back to places I haven't thought about in years?" I equated "how could it be otherwise" as it really made me think of books that I read during a certain time in my life and brought back memories, some good and some bad, in the same way that music can sometimes prompt us to think about these things. In line 4, I knew that the book we were going to talk about was a little golden book because that's the only book that has that memorable spine, and that was also inferencing and text to self. Those are some of my favorite books as well, so that was a making connection to text to self type of thing. Lines 5 and 6, the author talked about the title of the story, so I synthesized information because I haven't personally read that specific book. It made me want to have the book with me so that I too could open up the first page and read and see what she was seeing. Line 7, and comparing to this first paragraph up here, the way that the author writes is almost kind of like the same as the way this first page worked in the book that she has in front of her. The author uses the same type of format and organization as the author of this little golden book, based on what I can see so far. I say this just because of the arrangement of adjectives and verbs and the dialect that sounds a lot like more traditional English in the way it would have been taught a long time ago, or not a long time ago, but in the early 1900s or mid-1900s. Sorry, moving right along to line number 7 again. I made a connection, text to self, although I was not a despair to my mom and my sister, I was also a tomboy and was accepted to play with boys during recess activities such as football and kickball. So it made me kind of feel sad that this character was the despair of her mother and her sister just because she decided to play with the boys or run out into the forest of Wisconsin, those type of things. So then we moved on to 8 through 10. In lines 8 through 10, I adjusted the reading pace and made connections. I had to reread these lines and slow down to really absorb. I put quotations in my list around absorb, just because the way the author is talking about her experience just as much as the characters. Then I went back and reread line 1 when I was thinking about the word absorb and experiences, because the author's note about being absorbed in the story like you were there. I felt as if I too was swimming with my clothes perched on top of my head, even though I had never done so. So when she talks about swimming, I've never actually swam with clothes up on my head, but it was pretty interesting because the way she was describing it with adjectives and personal experience made me feel like I had been there. Also on line 8, text to world and inferencing, I can inference this book was published in the early 1900s because of the way the author points out that the first black and white illustration was present. And also in line 7, it sets the story timeline for that story, our little golden book, in 1864. A question I had about line 10 was carrier pigeons. I know that pigeons are a bird, but I don't really know what the difference is between a carrier pigeon and a regular pigeon. So I was intrigued about that. Moving on to line 11, thinking critically and text-to-self connection. When I was growing up, there was less pressure to act like a lady. It wasn't the same type of, same type of presence of that message in my household, and I don't think as many households as it used to be. Because of the way they said act like a lady, I thought that maybe our author grew up in the the 40s to the 60s of the 1900s, just because I know that was a very high standard for women at that time, and mothers and grandmas were always telling their daughters to act like ladies, or to act like a lady more. I can infer this because of critical thinking about background knowledge that this author could have grown up in the 40s through the 60s, because that was an important task, and women and gender roles were more prevalent during that time. Moving on to line 14. Text in the plain drawings prompted recollections, the way familiar tastes and smells spontaneously revive memories that I haven't visited for years. When I read that, I made a connection to the way earlier I had made a comment about how not only do books and words make connections to certain times in your life, but music also does that for us. Can bring you back to a certain time when you were reading a certain book and you felt a certain way. So it invokes memories of emotions and memories of events. Line 16. I had to adjust my pace and reread. I had to slow down to read the sentence, in quotes, that makes the read indistinguishable, it's a hard word to say, from the lived. I had to reread the sentence because at first I was confused by the way in which the author used the word indistinguishable. But after rereading it, I felt like I could comprehend it a little bit more. So this whole paragraph, 17 through 23, I made a lot of connections. I think because of who I am as a reader, my strength is in making connections, and that's the way that I comprehend text. So when I was reading this paragraph, it really spoke to me about how this teacher was a lot like my mom. The way the author said the teacher introduced me to Caddy, it was almost like how when my mom finds stories she thinks kiddos in her class might like, she really goes out of her way to try and find them. And the way the author said I liked Caddy because I saw myself in her, I think that's another way that she talks about being absorbed in the experience or in the story that you're reading. The author also talks about her childhood fantasy and how she connects to Caddy. And that's, I think, the way she remembers Caddy later when she finds the book in Goodwill. Excuse me. I think it's also important to remember that when you're reading and you find little snippets of characters that you resonate with, that makes you want to read more because you see yourself in someone else or in a character in a book. Lines 24 through 27, so we'll scroll down here for you. This author had the same teacher 2 years in a row, and so I think that also helps with connections. I used making connections again as my way because I think that's just who I am. That's just who I am as a reader, like I said earlier. This may seem redundant as my reading behavior for me, but I see or are absorbed in this book because so much of what the author uses to describe her teacher resonates with me when I think about my mom. For example, my mom too uses interests for English, language arts, and instruction, and specifically in regard to the outfits and types of lessons she would utilize. My mom had a specific outfit for when she was the science lady of their classroom, and kids were so captivated, and I feel like they really remember their science instruction based on the way she made it so important and made it different from all the other subjects because she decided to use a separate personality or outfit, etc. Line 29, I had an idea on the way the teacher talks about omni-reading and how she sets up a specific area for kiddos to sit with pillows and a giant cardboard wall for privacy. I think sometimes reading gets lost as a whole body experience when we go into elementary school just because of lack of resources or materials. So I think my idea, or other reading behavior was that I needed to make a note that in my own classroom, I need to make sure that I intentionally have materials and space dedicated for teachers and students to read so that it stays a whole body experience. Line 34 through 36. Making connections and thinking critically and analyzing information. I'm still a little confused on the timetable for when this article was published, but I'm thinking the author could have still been a child or growing up in the 40s through the 60s. Another great connection is that all teachers should develop lesson plans that account for student interest, analyzing the fact that this teacher really instilled that all interests should be accounted for and encouraged, but that it can be encouraged and stimulated in another way other than just reading. I think that's really important for me to remember as a teacher, just because reading is my go-to and that's how I enhance my learning. So I need to remember when I'm teaching that not all kids learn that way and stimulate their knowledge or their growth of knowledge just through reading. Line 36, making connections again. The author states that when children read something that builds on foundation of their own lives, it really hit home for what I want my reading instruction philosophy to be based around. You cannot make connections if you don't have anything to connect with. So just kind of providing those background knowledge or background details for kiddos in my class, just like this teacher did for her students and specifically for our author in regards to the little golden book that she was reading. Line 38, which is down here, analyzing information and making connections. We all have moments where we don't understand the impact until a later time, and for the author, this one was one of those. Reading and enjoying reading are a critical reason as to why I'm getting my master's in reading education, and I believe that after this program, I can utilize my strength in making connections, just like this author did when she found her favorite childhood book in a Goodwill store years later. So reading instruction really can follow you in your life, and I want to make that something like Miss Zern did for our author. Line 39, it talks about how our author teaches at USC in Los Angeles, and she's also getting a master's degree, just kind of reinforcing that when you're a teacher, you're always a learner as well. And this was obviously an experience that stuck with this author, and that's why she wrote an article for us to read. Line 41, that's not listed, talks about when the article was published, so May of 1999, and that was just in my head a way to predict that my inference might have been correct, that our author might have been a child probably in the 60s instead of the 40s or the 50s, but when the ideal of acting like a lady was still pretty prevalent. So, yeah, those are all the reading behaviors I saw when I was reading this article. Thank you.